Okay, so thank you for inviting me to come and have a chat to you. I've worked in public affairs, campaigning, influencing, I suppose, for 20 odd years now. And I've seen it change quite a lot over that time. And I think that now is the time at which most change makers, campaigners, decision makers as well, are taking quite a big step back and asking themselves, what the hell is going on? And what is my place in it? And how can I influence what's happening? So I've been invited to talk to you about the Sheila McKechnie Foundation's Social Power Report. It's a big report. I'm not going to try and download the whole thing to you. It's available free online on our website, and I'll give you that at the end. But what I'm going to try and do is give you our big picture context, look in a bit more detail at one of the tools that came out of it, and then I'm going to kind of go off script. So this is not going to be the Sheila McKechnie Foundation talking. This is just going to be me reflecting on what it might suggest to us or give us clues about tackling polarisation, the rise of the far right. Really big issues that politicians, frankly, aren't really prepared to get their hands dirty with, for example. So the first half is me telling you about what we found over the last couple of years. There was a piece of research. It started in 2017. That was before I arrived, and it was still happening when I arrived. And it really only had one question. So what can we learn about how social change is happening today that can strengthen civil society's future efforts? It's a kind of gigantic question, and I think they've spent the first 6 months literally just unpacking what that might even mean. They spent 18 months in total talking to around 400 people, and that's change makers who were from small community groups, from massive charities, to some decision makers. And they spoke to individuals and organisations. And that took the shape of about 20 or 30, I think, different separate group conversations, at which they began with what even is social change, what's campaigning, and they found quite a lot of interesting stuff. I suggest you go and read the report, so I shouldn't go into it now. I could be here for hours. But this was the final report, Social Power. And the reason it's called Social Power is because, in terms of the headline findings, none of this should come as any surprise to you, we found that civil society is at the centre of a lot of significant change. That's not just recently, that's over the last couple of centuries, at least. I suppose that might be when you first find sort of recognisable civil society as we might think about it today. And when it is working at its best, it's driving absolutely transformational change. It unlocks resources, it shares power, it gets upstream of problems before decision makers are even really trying to tackle them. Civil society is there trying to understand what's happening and try to understand how it might support and intervene to stop it from happening. Oh, bear with me, I don't know how to use this. And what we said was that we concluded that civil society probably has the potential to tackle some of the most pressing problems that society faces today. At the time, we mentioned things like climate breakdown, knife crime. There was already a lot of evidence that civil society was really getting stuck into that. But I think probably since even the report came out, the rise of the far right and extremism is probably very much on that radar. And that potential we called social power. But we found it's being constrained. It's being constrained by civil society itself, by the way it organises itself, by its own cultures. It's being constrained externally by government, by policies, but also by popular sort of perception or analysis of what civil society is even for, what's its proper place. I'll use that well-worn and probably misquoted phrase, it should stick to the knitting. But I think what we found was that that even on its own, just those ideas were actually stopping civil society from really finding its social power fully. Anyway, so in the context of this conference, I'd like to share with you one of the tools from the report, and that's the social change grid. So bear with me while I explain it, and have a little patience, because it is quite straightforward. So on the horizontal x-axis, you will find a spectrum which goes from the single individual to the whole of society. And then on the vertical y-axis, the spectrum goes from very formal, and that could be anything from structures to organisation, but things which are controlled and measured and therefore inherently quite predictable. And then at the very top of the y-axis have the informal, where you get much more towards very nearly chaotic. You really cannot know in advance what the results of your action are going to be. So the reason we came up with this was because we found, once we'd collected a huge amount of evidence and opinion and examples, that even when we looked in quite a lot of depth at a lot of the academic work, we were trying to compare apples and oranges, and frankly, it made no sense. I think we're all probably quite fond of saying social change is messy, and, you know, surprise, it is. But we found that this grid was a really helpful way. It's not a map, it's not scientific, but it's a helpful way of trying to look at lots and lots of different things which are not necessarily inherently similar, but starting to create out of that, being able to build a picture of how they interact. So, what you find then is in the bottom left, where things are much more formal and very much more focused on the individual, this sphere is labelled service provision. And you do find a lot of direct services in there, and that might be anything from a bed in a hostel through to sort of, family support service, things like that. But it also includes any point, I think, at which civil society touches the individual. And in terms of campaigning, that might be because an individual has a particular experience and then communicates about it to someone from civil society. I know that sounds like a bit of a distinction, but I'm just trying to stay away from like everyone's experience living in that bottom left. Remember, we're looking through the civil society lens. And then in the top left, where things become more informal but still much more small scale, that's where you find networks of people. That might be geographical communities, communities of interest, communities of particular types of experience. They might meet physically in person, they might meet online. There's all kinds of ways that those people interact, but essentially it's when people start to become more organised. And then in the top right, where again things are definitely much less formal, but certainly at a much bigger scale, that's where you find wider culture, and that's where civil society can interact with and influence cultural norms, public attitudes. It's where you find, social media, it's where you find traditional media, and we'll have some examples later. And then down in the bottom right, that is the much more formal but much more large scale. That's where our power institutions are essentially. And yes, it does include things like government and local government and the NHS and things like that, but we would also put into that space the very large civil society organisations which are so big that they actually wield formal power of their own in some way or another. So what we did was we looked at, there's all kinds of things you can map onto this grid, but just to give you an example, and this is a cut down version, you could probably add hundreds of things to this, but this is where we mapped different types of activism essentially, and different types of civil society activity onto it. So you can see that down in the bottom left is a lot of service related action, but as you get further up, as you go further up the y-axis, it becomes more about co-creation, it becomes more about relationship between the individual and the organisation, because you're moving slightly more away from the formal and predictable and into something where it's much more about that one-to-one interaction. And then as you lift up above that x-axis, again, community organising obviously is there. We put social enterprise in as well. And I think from the Sheila McKechnie Foundation point of view, we're kind of counting civil society as not-for-profit. But, that's a debate to be had, and it's not one the government necessarily shares. Over into the top right, again, campaigning in terms of attitude change, protest and demonstration live here. But actually, so do things like marketing and communications, which are you know, they're slightly further down towards the formal, but they're still very much about large-scale public sphere, probably unpredictable and uncertain impact. And then down in the bottom right again, all the usual things, you know, lobbying, public affairs, advocacy. We put citizens' juries down here. I think it kind of depends on the makeup of how they've been constituted, but yeah. So this is the more formal space, but it doesn't necessarily have to live within formal power structures, but very often there are things that spring out of formal power structures. Is this making sense so far? Brilliant. Seriously, if you want me to kind of just go back and do something again, just give me a wave. Okay, so then we used the grid to map some successful instances of social change, just to see how they moved around the grid. And essentially what we found was that in the really successful, and by successful I think we would say they worked or they are working, and that they were sustainable and became embedded, we found that things pinballed around it wildly. You very rarely found an instance of successful social change that lasted that only lived in 1/4 of the grid. And that's really important because a lot of civil society organisations only operate in 1/4. So that was when we realised that we had the opportunity to really challenge civil society about how it thought about its work. So let me show you the living wage one. This is all done in hindsight, and obviously it's put into a grid, so it's neatened up. So it's going to look a lot more linear than in reality it really was. So that's my health warning. So at the beginning, Citizens UK came together and brought together people from lots of different communities. And they sat down with them and asked them what needed to change. This was, I think, over in East London. And they identified low pay as a massive factor in well-being. They spoke and built relationships with individuals who could give testimony and tell their story and who were keen to be supported to do so. And that led to much more in-depth community organising, and in particular things like direct action on employers, pickets, and support coming from outside the employee groups. As public appetite for these stories grew, and the whole concept of a living wage really did capture the public imagination, everything moved into the public sphere much more clearly. And of course, you started to get political support. You don't have to be able to read this, don't worry, I'm just kind of giving you a sense of the story. So like the Mayor of London supported it, the leader of the Labour Party at the time, who I think was Ed Miliband, came out and publicly supported the concept of a living wage. And the London Olympics decided to pay the living wage as well. That's obviously a very formal, big institution, and affecting individuals in particular. Academics got in on the act. The JRF and Loughborough University actually create a way of calculating what the minimum income standards should be. And the Living Wage Foundation, still down in that formal bottom right-hand quadrant, is set up to be the interface with employers, so that employers actually want to accredit as being living wage payers. And then what happens is, as a result of that, up in the public sphere, and as the story spreads, employers start to see the reputational benefits of adopting the living wage, and accreditation starts to rise. And essentially, the living wage becomes a mainstream idea. I think that it's probably something that you would overhear people talking about occasionally in pubs at work. It became part of the narrative about what it is to be working today. And of course, as inevitably happens, the government co-opts the idea as soon as it hits that top right quadrant. They're like, we'll have some of that. And they announce their own national living wage, which I would imagine would make most of the people who've been striving for a living wage for like a decade spit feathers. But, they continue on. Employers now have to pay the national living wage, which is not a real living wage, but, potentially you could argue is a step forward. And it does start to actually impact on individuals. I'm unclear how far people who are now paid the national living wage understand that it's not a real living wage, but certainly at least the concept of what a living wage is, the question does remain. And the campaign continues. So this change is not finished by any means, but you can see that it's operated across every single quadrant of the grid. It has touched everything from the individual to the whole of society, from formal power right up to the sort of more public, more unpredictable sphere. I am not going to go through this one, but just to give you an example of what happens when you try to track change, which has been going on for absolutely decades, is non-linear, is distributed, and includes a huge amount of different actions. I sat down with a woman called Dr. Angela Raffle from Bristol University, and we tried to map the Bristol Food movement, which I think started in the late 60s. I can't even read that, it's so tiny. Yeah, in the 60s. So this is essentially what happened. I can't even tell you how long it took me to do this. And I had to select, like, the highlights. So the latest one you'll see is, one of the community farms can now crowdfund for a new tractor and be fairly confident that they're going to get the money, which is quite a massive shift from, like, probably 20 or 30 years ago. And we showed this to a whole bunch of campaigners in Bristol. We knew that this would kind of slightly make their head explode. So Angela suggested we follow it with this diagram. This doesn't belong to the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, and I'm afraid I don't know exactly who it does belong to. So if anyone knows, I would be really grateful for a way to cite it properly. But she said you can essentially, because the Bristol Food Movement is a movement and not a top-down campaign, you can calm everyone down about, oh my God, what's the right thing to do? How are we going to get from A to B? What's my job in it? By just showing them this, which is essentially, as long as you're sort of sharing the goal with us, we don't care what you do. We'll support you to do what you like, and we want you to do what you love. But you can do everything from, like, practical proof of concept activity, which in their case is things like community farms and shared kitchens and stuff like that, through to sort of awareness raising, whether that's, I don't know, like making a short film or just talking to people who you know, and then much more kind of strong holding activity like protest or lobbying of decision makers. And she says that she finds this diagram really does chill people out, so that's just my tip for when people are feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of a problem that they need to tackle. It's notable that the Bristol Food Movement has very little central coordination, but in terms of what we are thinking about at this conference, I would also note that I don't think they have the same sense of urgency. They know it's a long-term issue. People's lives are not going to be destroyed by a lack of organic food in Bristol directly tomorrow, but they do know that it's a long-term problem that if they don't tackle will contribute to all kinds of social and environmental problems. So that's the grid, and it's a really useful thing. We've used it to map everything from a single campaign's course through to sitting down with, for example, funders and helping them to map out what they fund. And in very often the really useful information they get from that is like where the gaps are. So you can map all of your stuff and go, oh God, we don't do anything in the top left. Is that an oversight? The answer might be no, it's not an oversight, it's very conscious. But it's a really useful exercise to do. So I'm going to pause there for a second before I move on to my provocations, if you like, on what this might suggest to us with regard to tackling polarisation. So, but does anyone have any questions or observations that they would like to ask? Have I been incredibly clear or incredibly boring? I don't know. Yeah, that's fine. Does anyone need any clarification?
Use the catch box again. Are you ready?
Is there a danger that the social change grid is oversimplified and there might be another dimension which is missing?
Oh, we are very open to that. We know it's not the end of the road. Is there a particular one that you feel isn't captured?
No, I can't think of one, but I'm just wondering, it just seems quite neat, and I'm wondering whether there's something that comes out of the screen.
Yeah, that is why the health warning. I mean, we are conscious this is a tool, not a map. So we know that there may be aspects of change. I think what we particularly found during our conversations when we were looking at all this massive evidence was that if only we can make a 3D map, this would be a lot easier. Because yes, I think there are probably issues around time. There are probably issues around relative strengths of allies and detractors. So yes, you're right. I think there probably are different dimensions that you would love to be able to map if only you had one of those Star Trek kind of hollow things.
Hi, Chloe. I think if you join the ends, you've got a sphere, and if you add then the energy of the dynamism, the pinball effect that you've actually got the three-dimensional map right there, I think.
That'd be brilliant.
It feels harder to
computer?
understand. Yeah, I'm sure you probably could. I don't know if there is another dimension. It's just that it's been flattened in your
It
representation.
has been flattened. We are very conscious of it, but yeah. If anyone has any brilliant ideas about how we can do that, we are really open to it. We just got some new computers as well, so it might work.
Anyone else got something quick you want to ask? Shall we move on? Okay.
So, at this point, I am going to, like I say, go off script. This is not the Sheila McKechnie Foundation's findings. As much it's me sitting down and thinking, all right, in the context of tackling polarisation, what observations or provocations might I offer to you which might stimulate a bit of a conversation amongst ourselves? So, my first one is that you need to be able to build and or disrupt in all four quadrants if you're going to tackle something which needs to be tackled urgently. So there's a really big question for you about who is already deeply embedded in those quadrants. And they may be your allies, or they may be your detractors, or even your opponents. So that doesn't mean that you as an organisation or as an individual need yourself to be able to do it in all four of those quadrants, but you need to know who can, and you need to be connected to them, because change which doesn't occur across, at least, across big chunks of those four quadrants, generally speaking, doesn't last. You can pass a law making something illegal, and I think fox hunting is an amazing example of that. But frankly, unless the communities in which it's supported also agree, fox hunting is going to continue. Plus, you're dealing with people who have quite a great deal of formal power themselves in lots of instances. So, I'm sure there are lots of examples of that where change has been really focused in the bottom right. We must change this law, and we've forgotten to change public attitudes. We've forgotten to go and speak directly to communities. I'm not suggesting that campaigning organisations like Legal Cruel Sports and people like that failed. They didn't. They won. But I think, based on our expanded understanding of how change sticks, maybe if we went back another 20 years and did it again, we would do it slightly differently. My second observation is that if you want to operate across all four quadrants, either yourself or with your allies, you need to build and fight for your legitimacy to do so. You need to be confident that you both can and should be prepared to enter any one of those spaces. In some instances, that might be genuinely having to change the way you do things in order to garner that legitimacy. I think people are very, very aware that a big organisation parachuting itself in and speaking for a particular group of people or community without those people having a voice within that conversation, frankly, for lots of different reasons, which we could unpack over an entire day, doesn't work. And it doesn't work for lots of reasons, but primarily because it lacks legitimacy. So ask yourself whether you are legitimately in all four of those quadrants, or you or your allies. And I would make a particular plea, I think, and maybe it doesn't really apply to this audience, but to ask how confident you are about being political. Because I think a lot of the constraints that we found during the course of this research on civil society did stem directly from policies like legislation like the Lobbying Act, policies like gagging clauses, and just the narrative, the public narrative about what civil society legitimately can and can't do. So I'm afraid, I know you're very busy, fighting for social justice, but you're also going to have to make time to fight to be in those spaces. Reflecting on fragmentation, I think that one of the things, particularly the Bristol Food movement, but I think a lot of instances of change that we looked at tell us that you can fight fragmentation without being of one mind. So if you're taking a different approach because the status quo isn't working, there's a risk that you could magnify fragmentation. that kind of us and them feeling, which I think it wouldn't be particularly bold to say is very much at the heart of the sort of the rise of polarisation and extremism. So you don't all need to be on the same page to have a similar destination. And I think a really good example of this is Extinction Rebellion. So they occupied the offices of Greenpeace, calling for a change to sort of what they saw as Greenpeace just doing business as usual. But their public statement about it began with the words, "Greenpeace, we love you." So they were very, very clear that they felt they had to do this to shake things up, but they were not doing it because they felt separate from Greenpeace, that they were just disappointed in the way Greenpeace had started to go about things. So I think there are ways to take very different positions without polarising yourselves, without polarising yourself against your own allies. And frankly, anyone who spent 10 minutes on Twitter will kind of know exactly how that happens. My fourth, I think, point is about looking at the way you're going about your campaigning, and if you're working across all four of those quadrants, either alone or preferably with your allies, to surface different viewpoints and ideas, that will contribute in the longer term to a broader worldview. That will itself fight that kind of fragmentation of perspective and belief and attitude. So if you believe that division and alienation are themselves a breeding ground for extreme views, you really have to make sure that your own activism doesn't contribute to that. In fact, arguably, and again, I do appreciate that capacity is a really big issue, arguably your activism has to actively prevent it. You know, gay people in some states of the US now are seeing exactly what happens when public attitudes are attacked, and that means that the social contract, if you like, for the legislation that's been put on place starts to be withdrawn. And it's scary, and it's really scary. So that might also be another really good argument for a diverse set of organisations working on particular issues. Your big, well-resourced ones can afford to continue to make sure that that space is held, while maybe smaller ones work on issues which are still to be won. I would argue, would I argue it? I would maybe observe that one reason the Leave campaign has generally been more effective, and I count this as an ongoing conversation, is that there was no real embedded narrative in our society about the benefits of EU membership for decades, for absolutely decades. So down in the bottom right quadrant, formal power removed education about the EU from schools as we were, I mean, I had none when I was growing up. And when I first started working for an MP, one of the big hoo-has at the time was that the EU was sending an educational bus around the country to visit libraries and things like that, to talk to people about the EU, which was immediately branded propaganda and banned, which was bizarre. And as a result, individuals don't associate any particular benefit to them from EU membership with their own personal experience, because how would you identify it if you have no idea really what the EU does and how it operates? And again, that also means that there's no real compulsion in the community quadrant for people to organise beyond already very highly interested groups. So the Remain campaign had such a huge amount of catching up to do in that top right-hand quadrant, that public sphere, and that was the sphere, frankly, that swung it. And it goes beyond EU bad, UK good, and it goes really beyond the concept of whether we are independent in the EU or outside the EU. There's now a lot of quite interesting analysis about, for example, why people who themselves are immigrants to this country have backed the Leave campaign. And actually, the theory is, or part of the observation, is that for many of them, it feeds straight into their own personal narrative and the role of the British Empire, which holds strangely sort of contradictory roles in their personal experience and in their lives. So yeah, it's interesting to me that I think one of the things that this grid tells us is that by operating across all four of those quadrants over the longer term, it's very possible to actually start building a much greater I don't mean conformity, I don't think, but maybe a unity of understanding about each other at the very least. And I say also, so finally, I would say that by building individual people's social power, by connecting them into networks and communities, as you are making change happen, you are going to make that change stronger. That will itself feed into that public sphere. And quite a good recent example of that I came across was actually at our Last Change Network event, which Natasha ran, which was about fossil fuel divestment. And one of the things that more than one of the participants said was that it's actually about building people's individual power locally. That's kind of the root of it, regardless of where they are in the world. The role of the movement is to then connect those people and to get them to do what they love, get them to do what they're interested in, to start to tackle that, the sort of the financial power of the financial investment in fossil fuels and the social license to operate. And the thing that they all agreed on was that the wonderful thing about that is that it would have impact way beyond the change they were trying to achieve. Just say in a year's time, fossil fuel companies begin to completely, like themselves, start to divest and start to leave that carbon in the ground. The power that they've built within those individuals and communities will remain for much longer than that happens. So that's my kind of thoughts that I've just sort of spewed out to you and my provocations. And I would be really interested to hear if any of them chimed with you, if any of them, I don't know, make you want to ask other questions. I don't really want to sort of stand up here as some sort of expert on polarisation, but I hope I've started a conversation. Come on.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we've only got 10 minutes left, and then we're going to go for lunch, so we don't have a huge amount of time. It would be awesome for us to have more time to talk about this. But in the time that we have people got things? If I throw this back, can you catch and pass to Karina behind you? Because I can't throw that far, it'll just be terrible.
To remind me of the famous incident where I threw lollies into the crowd at ACF and nearly got someone in the eye. But anyway, so my question is, with the gagging laws and with a lot of organisations that have campaigning now getting nervous about campaigning and retreating back to policy and research rather than campaigning, do you think the role for social enterprises and the non-organised campaign groups, so they're not formalised organisations, can come into play a little bit more? And part two, how can the more established organisations work with those in a way where they can support them maybe with research and the policy, and let those organisations take that campaigning space a bit forward?
Well, I've got some good news, which is that we've noticed over the last 6 to 12 months at the Sheila McKechnie Foundation that we're getting more and more queries from people, especially larger organisations, who want to be better at collaborating. So that's really good. However, we do also observe that the very large organisations do genuinely find it difficult. And I would say that over the past year, I think we've learned that for the very large ones, particularly those for whom campaigning is not necessarily their absolute number one goal, the change kind of has to start at board and senior management level. Individuals working for the organisation can absolutely press for it, but until those levels change, until that confidence comes from chief execs, boards, things like that, it's going to be very difficult for individual campaigners to be confident and bold in what they recommend the organisation does if they're constantly knocked back. So good news that they want to do more collaboration. Bad news that it might be a little bit slower than we would all hope. Social enterprise. We've had social enterprises using this grid. That's really interesting. And one of the things that we have found, we've only done it once or twice, they, when they start to map the kind of ecosystem in which they're operating, so if I'm a brilliant young programmer who's come up with an app that does X, and I do keep saying that the reason I've designed this is to improve people's lives. once I start to understand the ecosystem in which this is supposed to be operating, we found that it does change people's perspective. I don't know yet whether they go and change their behaviour or their decisions, but certainly changes their perspective about who they need to speak to. You know, maybe, I should have done this earlier in the process. I should have spoken to all these people. So again, I would say that the answer is potentially, and definitely small organisations, I think, can have more freedom to campaign, but we've also come across small ones who find, especially gagging clauses, they feel similarly constrained. So I'd say it's patchy. Sorry, that was a very rambling answer.
Hi. Your last provocation was really interesting. The one about, I think you sort of described it as the role of movements and the role of individuals.
Yes,
is that
what,
fair?
building people's power?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit about like what prompted that provocation? Like, is there something based in the social power report that led you to see that distinct from organisations?
Yes, I think so. I think actually it was my previous provocation that prompted it, which was about trying to think about how you tackle fragmentation without attempting from the top down to make everyone the same. Or think the same way. That's never going to happen. We're human beings. We are a very diverse group. But I did see the potential in working across all those quadrants to build sort of maybe more robust worldviews, maybe, or robust sort of connections of understanding between people. And then when I sort of also was reflecting on that whole fossil fuel divestment conversation, it made me realise that part of that wasn't just organisations being better at broadcasting what they think or what you should think across all four quadrants, that actually for something to be truly sustainable, it really does have to begin with people and be something that people choose, not just that people have seen a lot of adverts for. It's sort of, that's kind of comes quick and goes quick. So yeah, I guess I was, it was those two things, building that more robust shared experience maybe, and then thinking about how that can be made to last. Because we all share the experience of, say, you know, I don't know, being excited about the last series of Game of Thrones, but I can't imagine we'll all be talking about it in 6 months necessarily. But certainly a shared experience which says, you know, I understand these people better, that's really exciting. This is the moment when I understood it, what about you? Yeah, that feels like something that could actually last potentially across generations, if I'm not being too dramatic about it.
Thanks.
Anybody else? We have time for at least one more, maybe more than that.
Hey, I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. I guess I'm not quite sure how to pose this question, but I feel like you might have some interesting thoughts on the idea that with populism, a lot of like discreditation has gone towards the institutional power quadrant. So parliaments being undermined by sort of Brexiteers and people that are sort of challenging the legitimacy of democracy. Same with sort of things like the judges and like policymakers that are all being discredited as experts and the broken politics and stuff. So with that in mind, that quadrant being undermined so much by, you might say the right, or you might say populists, obviously left-wing populists too, how would you see that quadrant like reconfiguring itself, and like what can people do to sort of rebalance the books a bit so that that quadrant doesn't become the new one that gets neglected in politics now?
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Yeah, I
Sorry,
think
it's
it does.
a bit blurbed, but
No, I think it does. Yeah,
comes together.
I mean, I suppose maybe where I would point to is, okay, so if we go think about the grid again, some of the really fundamental changes that have happened, and I know I'm talking about like specific social changes here, but I think it can probably apply as much to reputation and engagement and buy-in with a particular type of person or organisation as it does to a change. A lot of the really big headway has been made in the top right sphere. So if we're thinking about, I've been looking a lot at the Irish abortion referendum, which sort of was nearly a year ago now. in the UK, the campaign for equal marriage, stuff like that. Things which have very important changes and decisions to be made in that bottom right. You know, in Ireland, they needed to change the constitution and pass legislation. In England and Wales, we needed to literally, you know, to pass a law, but the change itself had to happen in the top right. People had to be not just ready for it, but be like, why haven't you done this already? This is ridiculous. And I had quite a good conversation with a guy called Benjamin, what's his surname? The guy from Pink News, who was basically saying that he thought a lot of the change had happened on like morning TV. You know, civil partnerships came in, suddenly you could get like a celeb who'd just done their civil partnership, sitting on the sofa with like whoever does morning TV now, talking about, you know, what the couple were going to wear, where they were going to go on honeymoon, you know, what it would mean for them in terms of their everyday lives. And this just made it something which I think had it gone on very much longer, people would have genuinely just been like, I really don't even understand why this needs legislation. What the hell is going on? So I would suggest that in order to change the relationship and the reputation of formal power holders, whether that's like an NHS manager or an MP or whatever, we need a much better narrative in the top right. I mean, I've been kind of unpopularly saying for about 20 years that actually I think MPs are, largely speaking, incredibly hardworking. It's not a job I would want to do, and most of them are genuinely in it to try and make the world a better place. I might not agree with how they want to go about it, but I do generally believe that their motivations are sound and ones that I can back. And I just think quite possibly not enough of us have been having that conversation out loud. How you do it en masse and quickly, genuinely don't know. I suppose part of it is to humanise those people and stop the human beings inside the robes being only seen as their offices of power. Hey, you know, I want a High Court judge on the sofa on Lorraine or whatever. So, yeah, I think a lot of that is going to happen in the top right. And not just doing it for them, and I think the way that those office holders start to interact with people will be a really big change as well. I think those institutions are beginning to themselves change their own power analysis and understanding that it can't just be top-down anymore. I think at the moment a lot of the initial attempts are quite kind of cack-handed, but it's the right motivation to want to go out and speak to communities and constituents. It's the right... But we don't yet in this country have very many structures which really genuinely link people who are networked together, whether it's over an issue or a geographic area, with holders of power. Not very effectively yet. Citizens' assemblies, we often kind of look over at Ireland and go, oh, they're the magic bullet to all of our difficult issues. And they certainly could be a way of tackling them. I have lots of thoughts about citizens' assemblies in the UK. But so I think maybe we're maybe entering a time of experimentation, and it's one that civil society could really support. It's that I think we have to experiment.
Of course.
Good. Yeah, that's all the questions that we've got time for. So yeah, I'd like to say thank you again to Chloe.
Thank you.